Boy disappeared in 1998. 17 years later, Mum plays his final voicemail and gasps. The scream was silent, a jagged hole ripped in the fabric of the night, heard only by the dust motes dancing in the sliver of moonlight piercing the attic gloom. It was the sound of a memory tearing, of a 17-year-old wound cracking open. Lorraine's hand flew to her mouth, not to stifle the noise, but to hold in the pieces of her heart that were suddenly trying to claw their way out of her chest. On the floor, nestled in a dusty cardboard box labeled Ethan Keepsakes, sat a small, brick-like, microcassette recorder. The cheap plastic felt cold and brittle in her hand, a relic from a time before the world had shrunk to fit inside. A glowing screen. A time before her world had shrunk to the size of a single, unanswered question. The date was August 12, 2015. 17 years. 17 years to the day since her son, Ethan, had vanished. He was 17 then, a mirror image of the years she had lost. He'd been all sharp angles and nervous energy, a boy vibrating on the frequency of a future he was desperate to reach. He was going to be a journalist, a documentarian, someone who told the stories that mattered. He had a cheap camera he'd bought with saved-up lawn-mowing money, and a righteous fire in his eyes that both thrilled and terrified her. That last night, he'd been buzzing with it. He was going out to get the shot of a lifetime, he'd said, his voice crackling with a significance she hadn't understood. He was going to the old Blackwood Quarry, on the edge of town, where the monolith of Blackwood Enterprises was hosting its annual summer gala for the town's elite. It was a place of stark contrasts. The manicured lawns and glittering marquees set against the jagged, gaping wound of the earth from which the Blackwood family had extracted its fortune. "I'll be back late, Mum," he'd promised, kissing her cheek, his own rough, with the first hints of a beard she'd teased him about. Don't wait up. But she had waited up. She'd waited all night, watching the headlights of passing cars paint fleeting stripes across the living room walls. She'd waited all the next day, her calls going straight to the new voicemail service he'd been so proud of. And then, the waiting had curdled into a thick, suffocating dread that had become the atmosphere of her life. The police investigation had been a masterclass in futility. A teenage boy probably ran off, they'd suggested with weary sympathy. Maybe he'd fallen into the quarry, a place notorious for teenage misadventures. They'd dragged the murky water, but the quarry was a labyrinth of submerged caverns and abandoned machinery. It kept its secrets. The only person of interest was the last one to admit seeing him, Alistair Blackwood himself, the patriarch of the dynasty, a man whose face was carved onto the very foundations of their town of Havenwood. Alistair, then a man in his late 40s, all tailored suits and predatory charisma, had told the police a simple, dismissive story. He'd seen a boy with a camera lurking near the perimeter fence. He'd personally gone out and told the kid to scram, that it was private property. The boy, he'd said with a condescending smirk, had been mouthy, defiant. He'd run off into the woods that bordered the estate. That was it. An open and shut case of a troublemaking teen who'd met with an unfortunate, but self-inflicted end. The town, dependent on the Blackwood payroll, had nodded in solemn agreement. The case went cold before it had ever truly been hot. But Lorraine knew her son. Ethan was brave, but he wasn't reckless. He was defiant, yes, but not stupid. And he wouldn't have just run away. Not without a word. The only thing the police had returned to her was the microcassette recorder. It had been found a week later, half buried in the mud by the river that snaked away from the quarry, miles downstream. The police technician, a young man with apologetic eyes, had told her it was water damaged. They'd managed to salvage only one recording, a garbled 30-second voicemail Ethan had tried to leave her just before midnight on the night he disappeared. For 17 years, Lorraine had been unable to listen to it. The raw physical evidence of his last moments was a pain too exquisite to bear. It lived in this box, a Pandora's box of grief she refused to open. Until tonight, spurred by the cruel anniversary, by a sudden, desperate need to feel him close. She had climbed the creaking attic stairs. Her fingers, trembling, had fumbled with the tiny buttons. Play, A hiss of static, the sound of a world unraveling. Then, his voice, tinny and distant, fighting through a storm of noise. It was the same garbled message she'd been told about, a message she'd memorized from the police transcript. Mum. It's bigger than Alistair. He's, oh God. The tapes. You have too. The old mill. Tell. Sheriff. Don't. The words were fractured, broken shards of a sentence. Then, a sudden, sharp sound, like a shovel striking rock. A muffled grunt. Another sound, wet and heavy. And then, nothing. Silence. The empty hiss of the tape. She'd heard the transcript 100 times. The old mill. The police had searched the abandoned lumber mill on the other side of the county. They'd found nothing, a dead end. But tonight, 17 years later, she wasn't just reading a transcript, she was listening. With headphones pressed tight against her ears, blocking out the world, blocking out the 17 years of empty silence. She was listening with a mother's intuition, an instinct honed by loss, and she heard something she had never heard before. Something the police, with their cold, technical analysis, had missed. She rewound the tape, her breath held tight in her lungs. She played it again, and again, leaning in, closing her eyes, shutting down every sense but hearing. Behind Ethan's frantic, fragmented words, behind the hiss and the crackle, there was another sound. It was faint, almost subliminal, a ghost of a noise. It was a rhythmic, metallic clinking. A soft, almost musical chime, clink, 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 pause, clink. It was a sound she knew. A sound that dredged up a memory from the deepest, most forgotten corner of her mind. It was the sound of her grandmother's wind chimes, but not just any wind chimes. Her grandmother had been an artist, a woman who worked with sea glass. She had a specific set she'd made for Lorraine's mother, crafted from antique cobalt. Blue glass bottles she'd found washed up on the shore. They had a unique, haunting tone, a sound unlike any other. After her mother passed, Lorraine had given them to a dear friend who had moved away years before Ethan was even born. A friend who had lived in a small, unassuming house, not near the old lumber mill, but tucked away in a quiet cul-de-sac, a house that backed directly onto the Blackwood estate. A house that had belonged to a quiet, nervous woman named Clara Peterson, and, in that instant, the silent scream that had started in the attic finally found its voice. It tore from Lorraine's throat, raw and ragged, a sound of 17 years of grief and rage and, for the first time, a terrible, terrifying flicker of hope, because the police hadn't gone to the old mill, they had gone to the lumber mill. Ethan had said, the old mill. And Clara Peterson's husband had been a miller. His family had owned the town's original grist mill, a stone building that had been decommissioned for 50 years, standing derelict and forgotten, not 500 yards from Clara's back garden. He hadn't said lumber mill. He'd said the old mill. And the wind chimes, those specific, cobalt blue wind chimes, had been singing their ghostly song in the background of her son's last, desperate message. The cliffhanger wasn't a question of what happened anymore. It was a question of who had heard it happen, and Lorraine suddenly knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the key to unlocking her son's ghost from his watery grave was hidden behind the terrified eyes of a woman who had spent 17 years pretending she hadn't heard a thing. Clara Peterson lived in the same house, a prison of beige siding and perfectly manicured rose bushes. Her life, from the outside, was a portrait of quiet widowhood. Her husband, George, had died of a heart attack a decade ago, leaving her with a comfortable pension and a profound desire to be left alone. She volunteered at the library, attended church on Sundays, and never spoke about the Blackwoods or the boy who had disappeared from the edge of their property. Lorraine knew this because she had tried to speak to her once. In the early days, Clara had been on the preliminary witness list, one of dozens of neighbors the police had half-heartedly interviewed. When Lorraine had approached her in the grocery store, her eyes wide with a mother's desperate plea, Clara had physically. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her shopping cart like a shield. "I'm sorry for your loss," she'd whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. It was The gala, there was music, fireworks. She had practically fled, leaving Lorraine standing in the canned goods aisle, with a heart full of cold, hard certainty. Clara was lying. The fear rolling off her in waves was more potent than any denial. Now, standing outside that same house 17 years later, the microcassette recorder feeling like a holy relic in her pocket, Lorraine felt that same certainty ignite into a raging fire. She was no longer the broken, pleading mother. She was an avenging angel, armed with a ghost's whisper. She rang the doorbell. The cheerful, four-note chime was a grotesque counterpoint to the dread coiling in her stomach. She could see a shadow move behind the frosted glass of the front door. A long pause. Then, the click of a deadbolt, and the door opened a crack, held fast by a brass security chain. Clara Peterson looked older, of course. Her hair, once a mousy brown, was now a cloud of silver white. The lines around her eyes and mouth were etched deeper, not by laughter, but by a constant gnawing anxiety. But the eyes were the same. Wide, frightened, and haunted. "Lorraine," she breathed, her voice a gasp. It wasn't a question. "Hello, Clara," Lorraine said, her own voice steady, betraying none of the seismic tremors shaking her from within. "It's been a long time. I need to talk to you about my son." The fear in Clara's eyes flared into panic. I told the police. I don't know anything." The door started to close. Lorraine's hand shot out, pressing against the wood. It wasn't an aggressive move, but it was firm, unyielding. "I think you do. I think you heard him, Clara. I think you heard everything." She pulled the recorder from her pocket. "I've been listening to his last message. The one he left for me." She held it up, a small, ugly piece of plastic that suddenly held the weight of a lifetime. There's a sound in the background. A very specific sound. Clara's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. She stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the door. "Wind chimes," Lorraine said softly, letting the word hang in the air between them. "Cobalt blue sea glass. Like the ones my grandmother made. The ones I gave you." The last vestige of Clara's composure crumbled. A sob caught in her throat. The door, no longer held by a steady hand, swung open slightly, the security chain drawing taut. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her terrified eyes. "You don't understand. You can't." "Make me understand," Lorraine insisted, her voice raw with 17 years of unanswered prayers. "He mentioned the old mill, Clara. Your husband's old mill. He was there, he saw something, and you heard it, didn't you?" Through the gap in the door, Lorraine could see past Clara into the hallway. And on the wall, hanging next to a faded landscape painting, was a framed photograph. It was a picture of a younger Clara and her husband, George, standing arm in arm. George was a bear of a man, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush stone. He was smiling, but his eyes were small and hard, like chips of granite. And behind him, Lorraine could just make out a detail in the background. A tool shed in their backyard. On the wall of the shed hung a long-handled shovel, its blade caked with what looked like dried mud. Clara followed her gaze. A fresh wave of terror washed over her face. She slammed the door shut, the deadbolt clicking into place with a sound of finality. But it was too late. Lorraine had seen it. A shovel. A mention of the old mill. And a woman so terrified she was practically vibrating apart. The story wasn't just about a missing boy anymore. It was about a secret buried in the earth, guarded by a silent, terrified witness. And Lorraine knew, with every fiber of her being, that Alistair Blackwood wasn't just a callous billionaire who had shooed away a teenage trespasser. He was a monster wearing a bespoke suit. Alistair Blackwood was untouchable. He was the sun around which the small planet of Havenwood revolved. His family had founded the town, built the library, funded the hospital, and employed 3 generations of its citizens. To speak against Alistair Blackwood was to commit social and economic suicide. He was a man who glided through life on a cushion of inherited power and ruthless ambition. His charm, a silken glove over an iron fist, He was now in his mid, his hair a distinguished silver, his face a roadmap of pleasantries that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a philanthropist, a pillar of the community, his name synonymous with progress and prosperity. But Lorraine remembered. The man from 17 years ago, the arrogance in his dismissal, the flicker of contempt in his eyes as he'd spoken of her mouthy son. He hadn't been a concerned property owner. He'd been a king swatting at a gnat. Ethan, in his youthful idealism, had seen something else. He'd become obsessed with the Blackwoods in the months before he disappeared. Not just their wealth, but the stories that whispered in the town's shadowed corners. Stories of shady land deals, of environmental corners cut at the quarry that had allegedly led to sickness in the downstream communities. Of political rivals who had suddenly and inexplicably dropped out of races. Ethan, with his camera and his burning sense of justice, had been trying to connect the dots. The gala, for him, hadn't been about crashing a party. It had been an assignment. He believed the Blackwoods were dumping toxic waste from their other, less regulated chemical subsidiaries into the abandoned shafts of the old quarry, under the cover of darkness. The gala, with its fireworks and loud music, would have been the perfect cover. He had called the local newspaper with his theory. An old, grizzled editor named Frank, a man now long retired, had told Lorraine years later that he'd dismissed Ethan as a conspiracy-addled kid. "I told him to be careful," Frank had said, his voice heavy with a regret that had festered over the years. "You don't poke a bear like Alistair Blackwood with a stick, son. Not unless you want to get mauled." Ethan hadn't listened. He'd gone to get his proof. His shot of a lifetime. He'd found something. The tapes, his voice had pleaded on the recording. What tapes? Videotapes? Audio tapes? Whatever they were, Alistair Blackwood knew about them. The conflict wasn't just Lorraine against a wall of silence anymore. It was David against the Goliath, who owned the town, the police, and the narrative. Her every move was watched. After her confrontation with Clara, strange things began to happen. A car, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, would be parked across the street from her house for hours at a time, pulling away whenever she stepped outside. She'd get hang-up calls, nothing but dead air on the other end of the line. Her mail was tampered with, a letter from her sister arriving already opened. It was classic, low-grade intimidation, designed to make her feel paranoid, to make her question her own sanity. It was Alistair's style, power exerted, not with a shout, but with a suffocating, invisible pressure. She tried to go to the police. The new sheriff, a man named Henderson, who owed his career to a Blackwood campaign donation, listened to her with a look of practiced pity. He listened to the microcassette, his face impassive. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is the same evidence we had 17 years ago," he'd said, handing the recorder back to her, as if it were contaminated. "Wind chimes. A different interpretation of the word mill. It's circumstantial. It's a stretch, it's grief." He said the last word with a finality that was meant to end the conversation. "We can't harass a respected citizen, like Mr. Blackwood, or a poor widow like Mrs. Peterson, based on a grieving mother's feelings." The condescension was a slap in the face. She was being managed, handled, dismissed as a hysterical woman, unable to accept the tragic, but simple, truth. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a bitter acid rising in her throat. Her son was a ghost, his final words a desperate, unheard plea. And the man responsible was being protected by the very system that was supposed to find him justice. Meanwhile, Alistair Blackwood became bolder. The local paper ran a front-page story announcing a new, multi-million-dollar philanthropic wing of Blackwood Enterprises, dedicated to environmental conservation. Alistair was quoted extensively, speaking of his family's deep commitment to preserving the natural beauty of Havenwood. At the press conference, held on the steps of the town hall, he stood beaming, accepting the mayor's fawning praise. He looked directly into the news camera, his eyes gleaming with a chilling self-satisfaction. It was a performance, a public act of laundering his reputation, and it was working. He was untouchable. Lorraine knew she had to get to Clara. The fear that kept the woman silent was her prison, but it was also the key. What had she seen? What had her husband, George, been a part of? The shovel in the photograph haunted Lorraine's dreams. George had been a groundskeeper on the Blackwood estate for over 30 years, a loyal dog. What would a man like that do for a master like Alistair? She began a campaign of quiet perseverance. She didn't confront Clara again directly. Instead, she started leaving things on her doorstep. A single, cobalt blue piece of sea glass. A photograph of Ethan, smiling, his eyes full of the future he never got to have. A copy of the police report, with the section about the water-damaged tape recorder highlighted. They were silent offerings, pleas to a shared humanity she prayed still existed beneath Clara's fear. One evening, returning from the grocery store, Lorraine found an envelope slipped under her own door. No stamp, no return address. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Inside was a single, small, brass key. It was old and slightly rusted. There were no words, no note, just the key. She knew what it was for. The old grist mill. The mill stood on the edge of what was now a protected nature preserve. A tract of land Alistair Blackwood had magnanimously donated to the town 5 years after Ethan's disappearance. A move that had earned him accolades and a hefty tax write-off. The building was a stone skeleton, its roof caved in, its windows dark and empty eyes. A heavy chain-link fence surrounded it, plastered with no trespassing signs bearing the Blackwood Enterprises logo. This was the escalation. Clara was too afraid to talk, but she had given Lorraine a way in. She was pointing her toward the truth, hoping Lorraine would be brave enough to find it herself. The fear was palpable. Why not just tell her? What was in that mill that was so terrifying it had to be approached through this clandestine game of clues? The answer, Lorraine suspected, was George. George, the loyal groundskeeper. George, with the hard eyes and the shovel. George was dead. He couldn't be hurt. But his ghost, and the secrets he'd kept for his master, still held Clara in a grip of iron. Perhaps it was a secret he'd confessed to her on his deathbed. A sin he couldn't take to his grave. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, Lorraine drove to the edge of the preserve. She cut through the woods, the beam of her flashlight dancing over gnarled roots and fallen leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The silence here was different from the silence of her empty house. It was a heavy, watchful silence, full of unseen things. The fence was tall, but there was a section near an old oak tree where the ground had eroded, leaving a gap just big enough to squeeze through. She found the gate Clara's key was for, a small rusted service door at the back of the mill, hidden by a tangle of overgrown ivy. The key turned with a reluctant screech of metal on metal. The door groaned open, revealing a cavern of absolute blackness. The air that washed over her was cold and foul, thick with the smell of mold, rot, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely chemical. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. The main floor was a graveyard of machinery. A massive millstone lay on its side, like a fallen god. Gears and pulleys, thick with rust and cobwebs, hung from the ceiling like sleeping iron bats. She made her way carefully across the treacherous floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ethan's voice echoed in her head. The old mill, he had been here. He had seen something. She found the stairs leading down to the cellar. They were stone, slick with moisture. Each step down felt like a descent into the underworld. The chemical smell was stronger here. It burned. The back of her throat. The cellar was a single, large, stone-walled room. The beam of her flashlight played over the damp walls, the dirt floor. And then it landed on something that made her blood run cold. In the far corner of the cellar, the dirt floor was different. It was disturbed. The earth was slightly raised, mounded in a rectangle, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It wasn't an ancient feature, it was newer, a patch, a grave dot. Lorraine felt her knees go weak. Was this it? Was this where they had put him? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She stumbled forward, her hand outstretched. as if she could somehow feel him through the cold, dead earth. But as the light moved across the mounded soil, she saw something else. It wasn't just a grave. There were objects half buried in the dirt, pushed into the mound like crude markers. They were large metal canisters, industrial drums, rusted, but she could still make out the faded stenciling on the side of one. A skull and crossbones, a warning symbol, and a single word: cyanide. The breath she finally managed to suck in was a gasp of pure horror. This wasn't just a grave, it was a toxic tomb. Ethan hadn't just been trying to expose illegal dumping. He had stumbled upon something far more sinister. They weren't just polluting the quarry. They were using the old mill, on protected land, as their own private chemical waste dump. The sickness in the downstream communities. It wasn't an allegation. It was a fact. It was murder, slow and insidious, committed for the sake of profit. And then, the true plot twist, the bomb that had been waiting 17 years to detonate, revealed itself. Her flashlight beam, shaking in her hand, drifted from the mound of poisoned earth to the stone wall behind it. And there, etched into the grimy stone, scratched with what must have been a rock or a piece of metal, was a single frantic message. Message left by her son, A.B., not alone. GP filmed it. Find the Kamera Nad, Al.V., Alistair Blackwood, P. George Peterson. Filmed it. George hadn't just helped bury the evidence, he had documented it. A man caught between loyalty to a monster and a flicker of self-preservation. He had created an insurance policy. The tapes, Ethan had said. He wasn't talking about his own tapes, he was talking about George's. Suddenly, the shovel in the photograph wasn't just a tool for digging. It was a symbol of a secret George had buried. A secret his wife was now terrified would be unearthed. The fear wasn't just for herself, it was for what her husband had done. He wasn't just a witness. He was an accomplice. The tension in that cellar was no longer just about grief and injustice. It was about a conspiracy that had poisoned the earth and stolen lives, protected by a powerful man and a dead man's secret. The stakes had skyrocketed from a personal tragedy to a corporate crime of horrific proportions. The camera. She had to find the camera. It was the only thing that could burn Alistair Blackwood's empire to the ground. And Lorraine knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that it had to be hidden somewhere in Clara Peterson's house. The house where the cobalt blue wind chimes had sung a requiem for her son. A song only a mother could have understood. The house was a fortress of fear. Lorraine knew she couldn't just knock on the door again. Clara had given her the key to the mill, a desperate, silent plea. But going further, revealing her husband's complicity, was a line she was clearly not willing to cross. The intimidation from Blackwood's people was real. If they suspected Clara was the weak link, her life wouldn't be worth the manicured roses in her garden. Lorraine needed a way in. But more than that, she needed to understand the shape of Clara's fear. It was rooted in George, the accomplice George, the secret filmmaker. Why would he film it? A man like that, a simple loyal groundskeeper, doesn't suddenly become a whistleblower. He does it for leverage. For protection. Or for blackmail. She spent 2 days watching Clara's house from a discreet distance. Parked at the end of the quiet cul-de-sac, she watched the black sedan make its slow, menacing passes. She watched Clara emerge only once, a small, hunched figure scurrying to her mailbox before retreating back into the safety of her beige prison. The camera had to be there. George would have kept his insurance policy close. Not in a bank, not buried somewhere else. It would be in the house, hidden in a place only he and, perhaps Clara knew, a place that felt safe. Lorraine thought back to the photograph. George and Clara, smiling, the toolshed in the background, the shovel, tools, a man's domain. It was too obvious. Blackwood's people would have searched the house after George's death, just to be sure. A heart attack, they'd called it. Convenient for a man holding a secret that could destroy his powerful boss. Had they found anything? If they had, Lorraine wouldn't be here. The secret would have been buried with George. So, it was hidden well. Hidden by a man who knew his life was in danger. She needed to force Clara's hand. She needed to make the Danger of staying silent greater than the danger of speaking out. She had the key to the mill. She had Ethan's final, scratched message. But it was still her word against the ghost of a dead man and the denials of a terrified woman. The plan that formed in her mind was reckless, born of 17 years of frustration and a sudden burning impatience. It was time to stop playing by the rules. The rules were written by men like Alistair Blackwood. Blackwood Enterprises was hosting another one of its self-congratulatory events, the annual dedication of the Blackwood Environmental Scholarship. At Havenwood High School, Alistair himself would be there, handing out an oversized check to a beaming, grateful student, polishing his halo for the local press. It was the perfect stage, public, televised by the local news, a theatre of his own making, and Lorraine was about to rewrite the script. She went to the only person in town she thought might listen. Frank, the retired newspaper editor. He was old now, living in a small condo, his days filled with crossword puzzles and regret. She laid it all out for him. The wind chimes, the mill, the message scratched on the wall. The canisters, her theory about George Peterson. Frank listened, his old, bloodhound eyes sharpening with an interest she hadn't seen in him for years. The journalist in him, long dormant, began to stir. It's still circumstantial. Lorraine, he warned, his voice a gravelly rumble. You walk into that auditorium and start making accusations. His lawyers will tear you to shreds. They'll paint you as a crazy, grieving mother. They'll destroy you. They've already destroyed me, Lorraine said, her voice flat. They took my son. What else is there? I'm not going in there to accuse him. I'm going in there to talk to Clara. The plan was simple, and it was terrifying. Frank, using his old press credentials, would get her into the event. She would wait for the moment Alistair was on stage, the cameras rolling, the entire town leadership watching. And then, she would approach Clara Peterson, who would be in the audience. She was a library volunteer. She would have been encouraged to attend. The night of the scholarship ceremony, the high school auditorium was buzzing. The air was thick with cheap perfume and expensive cologne, a microcosm of Havenwood's social hierarchy. At the front, the town council, the mayor, the chief of police all smiling, all basking in the reflected glow of Blackwood's generosity. And on the stage, a large banner, Blackwood Enterprises, investing in Havenwood's future. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Lorraine, sitting in the back with Frank, felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Her hands were clammy. She could see Clara, 4 rows ahead of her, sitting by herself at the end of an aisle. She looked small and frail, a ghost at the feast. She kept glancing nervously, toward the stage, toward the man who held her leash. Alistair Blackwood took the stage. 2 thunderous applause. He was in his element, a master showman. He spoke of community, of responsibility, of nurturing the next generation. He was charming, magnanimous, a benevolent king, bestowing gifts upon his loyal subjects. Every word was a lie, a polished stone, laid over a pit of poison and bones, as he held up the oversized check. Posing with the scholarship winner, the cameras flashed. This was the moment. Wish me luck, Lorraine whispered to Frank. You don't need luck, he grumbled. You've got righteousness. Go get him. She stood up and began to walk, not toward the stage, but down the aisle, toward Clara. People turned to look, their faces a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. A security guard, one of Blackwood's men, started to move toward her, but she didn't falter. She reached Clara's row just as a flicker of movement on the stage caught her eye. Alistair Blackwood had seen her. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes, even from this distance, narrowed. He knew. He knew who she was, and he knew who she was walking toward. A silent, deadly message passed between them across the crowded room. Lorraine ignored him. She stopped at the end of the row and looked down at Clara. The woman was frozen, her face a mask of pure terror. She looked from Lorraine to the stage. Trapped in the crossfire, Clara Lorraine said, her voice low but clear, audible only to the people in the immediate vicinity. It's over. I know about the mill. I know about the drums. I found what Ethan wrote on the wall, Clara started, to shake her head, a pathetic, silent denial. He filmed it, didn't he? Lorraine pressed, her voice a little louder now. A few more heads turned. George. He filmed Alistair. That's why you're so scared. You're not just protecting yourself. You're protecting a monster. On stage, Alistair's jovial mask was beginning to slip. He said something to the mayor, his smile fixed and hard. The security guard was moving faster now. They'll destroy you. Clara, Lorraine pleaded, her voice breaking with the urgency of it all. They'll say George was the only one involved. They'll say he was blackmailing Alistair. They'll ruin his name, and they'll come for you next, just to tie up the loose ends. Is that the legacy you want for him? A coward and a criminal. Tears were streaming down Clara's face, now. She was imploding, collapsing under the weight of 17 years of fear. The guard reached them, his hand clamping down on Lorraine's arm. Ma'am, you need to come with me. Let her go, a voice rasped. It was Clara. She was on her feet, her body trembling, but her eyes, for the first time, held something other than fear. They held a spark of defiance. She looked at the security guard, at the concerned faces around her, and then her gaze settled on the stage, on the man, whose smile had finally vanished completely. He's right, Clara said, her voice shaking, but growing stronger with every word. My husband, George, he was a good man. He was scared, but he wasn't a coward. The auditorium was silent now. The cameras, which had been focused on the stage, began to swivel, zooming in on the drama unfolding in the aisle. Alistair Blackwood stood frozen, a statue of rage. As his perfectly orchestrated evening spiraled out of his control, he knew it was wrong. Clara continued, her voice ringing through the silent hall. What Mr. Blackwood was doing at the old mill. The poison. He made George help him. He threatened him. He threatened me. She looked at Lorraine, a world of apology in her tear-filled eyes. But George left something behind. Insurance, he called it, to protect me. To make sure the truth came out if anything happened to him. This is absurd, Alistair boomed from the stage, finding his voice. This woman is clearly unwell. Security, remove them both. But no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Clara. It's in the house, Clara said, her gaze locked with Lorraine's, the camera. It's been there the whole time. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a breath of liberation. The fireplace. There's a loose stone in the back. He hid it there the night it happened. It was the plot twist delivered on a public stage. The hidden clue, revealed the conspiracy, laid bare. It wasn't just Lorraine's word anymore. It was the witness, the accomplice's widow, finding her voice in the most cinematic way imaginable. The tension that had been simmering for 17 years had just exploded. Frank was already on his feet, his old reporter's instincts firing on all cylinders. He was on his phone, barking at someone on the other end. Get a car. Get a warrant. Sheriff Henderson, you son of a bitch, you're on camera. The whole world is watching. What are you going to do now? Sheriff Henderson, seated in the front row, looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. He looked from Clara, to a furious Alistair on stage, to the news cameras that were now trained on him. He was trapped. The machinery of power that had protected Alistair for so long was now grinding him into dust, live on the 6 o'clock news. The cinematic payoff was about to begin. The house of cards was falling, and Lorraine, the grieving mother who had been dismissed and ignored, had just pulled out the bottom one. The hunt for the camera was on, and the truth, after 17 long years, was finally clawing its way into the light. The scene in the auditorium had detonated a bomb in the heart of Havenwood. The live news broadcast had captured it all. Tearful confession, Alistair's mask of philanthropy, cracking to reveal the furious tyrant beneath. Sheriff Henderson's deer-in-the-headlights panic. The story wasn't local news anymore. By the time Lorraine, Clara, and an invigorated Frank were driving away from the high school, it was already starting to ripple. Across statewide networks, the drive to Clara's house was a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Clara, huddled in the back seat, seemed to be shrinking and growing at the same time. The fear was still there, a tremor in her hands, but the terrible weight of her secret had been lifted, replaced by a fragile, terrifying resolve. "He made me promise I'd never tell," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "George, the night he hid it, he said, 'This is for you, Clara. If he ever comes for you, you use this. But if you can, you leave the dead buried.' He thought he was protecting me." "He was," Lorraine said, her voice softer now. She looked at the woman in the rearview mirror, not with anger, but with a profound, aching pity. "He gave you the weapon to fight back. It just took 17 years to find the courage to use it." They arrived at the quiet cul-de-sac, to find it anything but. 2 police cars were already there, their lights painting the street in garish flashes of red and blue. Sheriff Henderson, his face grim, was standing on the lawn, barking orders into his radio. He'd had no choice. The public exposure had forced his hand. To ignore Clara's on-air confession would be political and professional suicide. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered. Drawn by the commotion, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights, their whispers a chorus of shock and speculation. The fortress of silence around Alistair Blackwood was crumbling. Brick by brick, Henderson intercepted them as they got out of the car. "Mrs. Peterson, I need to secure the premises," he said, his tone brusque, avoiding Lorraine's gaze. "We'll get a warrant to search for this camera." "You don't need a warrant if she invites you in, Sheriff," Frank shot back, stepping between them. "And we are all going in. This stops being your private, Blackwood-funded investigation right now. The press is here." He gestured to a news van that was pulling up, its satellite dish already rising. Henderson's jaw tightened, but he knew he was beaten. He nodded curtly. They entered the house, a place that had been a silent tomb of secrets just an hour before. It now felt like the epicenter of an earthquake. Clara led them, her steps hesitant but sure, into the living room. It was a room frozen in time, filled with her late husband's heavy, dark furniture. At its heart was a large stone fireplace, cold and dark. "In the back," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. He loosened the stone behind the log grate. An officer brought in a crowbar. With Henderson, Frank, Lorraine, and a news camera operator looking on, he pried at the stones in the back of the firebox. One of them shifted. He pulled it free, revealing a dark, square cavity. Reaching inside, the officer pulled out a small metal box, sealed with duct tape. He handed it to Henderson, who placed it on the coffee table, as if it were an unexploded bomb. For a moment, everyone just stared at it. This was it, the ghost in the machine. The secret George Peterson had taken to his grave. Henderson carefully sliced through the old, brittle tape. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of yellow cheesecloth, was a small, 8mm video camera, and beside it, 3 small, hand-labeled cassettes. The labels, written in George's spidery, utilitarian script, were simple. Quarry, Night 1, Quarry, Night 2, and the last one. The one that made Lorraine's heart stop. Quarry, August 12, 1998. The date, her son had disappeared. They didn't have a projector. Henderson, with a sense of grim urgency, put the cassettes in an evidence bag and radioed the station to have a technician and the appropriate equipment brought to Clara's house immediately. The wait was excruciating. It was a space of suspended time, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Lorraine felt strangely calm. The storm she had been chasing for 17 years was about to make landfall. The technician, a young woman with nimble fingers and a serious expression, arrived 20 minutes later. She set up the projector and a small screen in the dim living room. The whir of the machine starting up was the only sound. Henderson picked the first tape. Quarry, Night 1. He threaded it into the machine. He hit play, got the image that flickered. Onto the screen was grainy, shot from a fixed, hidden position, likely from the woods overlooking a secluded part of the quarry. The vantage point was high, looking down on a clearing. The footage was shaky, clearly filmed by an amateur, but the content was damning. A Blackwood Enterprises truck, its logo clearly visible, backed up to the edge of one of the quarry's deeper pits. Two men in work overalls got out. Under the harsh glare of the truck's headlights, they began to unload large metal drums identical to the ones Lorraine had found in the mill and roll them over the edge. They tumbled into the darkness, followed by a faint splash that was barely audible on the tape's microphone. Frank let out a low whistle. Son of a bitch, he got it all. The second tape showed more of the same, a different night, a different truck, the same sickening crime. It was a systematic, calculated operation of illegal toxic waste disposal. Then, Henderson picked up the third tape. August 12, 1998. His eyes met Lorraine's for a fleeting second. A silent acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. He threaded the tape, he hit play. The scene was the same, but the atmosphere was different. There was a tension in the air, a hurriedness to the men's movements. The date stamp in the corner of the frame confirmed the night. This was it, and then a new figure entered the frame. A tall, well-dressed man, his silver hair glinting in the headlights. Alistair Blackwood. He wasn't just the architect of the crime, he was there, overseeing it, his hands dirty. He was arguing with one of the men, jabbing his finger, his face contorted in a mask of cold fury. Suddenly, another figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a skinny kid with a camera bag slung over his shoulder. He was half hidden behind a tree, but he was there, Ethan. He raised his own camera, and the unmistakable flash of his camera's bulb fired once, twice, a tiny pop of light in the darkness. All hell broke loose. Blackwood and his men spun around. Ethan, realizing he'd been seen, turned to run. But it was too late. The two workmen, moving with a brutal efficiency, were on him in seconds. They dragged him, kicking and struggling, into the center of the clearing, throwing him at Blackwood's feet. Lorraine let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Frank put a steadying hand on her shoulder. She was watching her son's last moments. The audio was poor, just muffled shouts over the sound of the truck's engine, but the visual was horrifyingly clear. Blackwood stood over Ethan, his face a mask of venomous rage. He was screaming at him, his words lost to the wind, but his meaning unmistakable. He grabbed Ethan's camera, smashed it on the ground, and then kicked it into the darkness. Ethan, brave, defiant Ethan, yelled something back. He got to his feet. And then, Alistair Blackwood did something that sealed his fate. He didn't just shove Ethan, he struck him. A single, vicious blow to the side of the head. Ethan crumpled. He didn't get up. The two workmen looked at Blackwood, their faces panicked. Blackwood stared down at the boy's still form, his own face a mixture of shock and cold calculation. There was a moment of horrifying stillness. The point of no return. Then Blackwood made a decision. He barked an order. One of the men ran to the truck and came back with a shovel. Lorraine couldn't breathe. She was watching her son's murder. She was watching them dig his grave, but they didn't. What happened next was the final sickening twist, the truth that was worse than anything she could have imagined. They didn't bury him. They picked up his limp body. They carried him to the edge of the pit, the same pit where they had been dumping the barrels of cyanide, and with a callous, horrifying heave, they threw him in. The camera kept rolling for another minute. It showed Alistair Blackwood watching the spot where his victim had vanished, his face impassive. It showed the men quickly rolling the last of the drums into the pit. A cascade of steel and poison, burying her son under a mountain of toxic evidence. Then they got in their truck and drove away, leaving the clearing empty, as if nothing had ever happened. The tape ended. The whir of the projector was the only sound in the room. A mournful mechanical cry. Lorraine was weeping, silent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Frank Helter, his own face a grim mask of fury. The young technician was pale, her hand over her mouth. Sheriff Henderson, his face ashen, slowly stood up. He picked up his radio, his hand shaking. "Get me a warrant," he said, his voice thick with a rage that was no longer feigned. "For the immediate arrest of Alistair Blackwood. The charge is murder." The cinematic payoff was not just an arrest, it was a public immolation. Alistair Blackwood was arrested an hour later. Not quietly, at his sprawling mansion, but at the Havenwood Founders Day Gala, the glittering apex of the town's social calendar, an event he himself was hosting. Sheriff Henderson, flanked by 2 state troopers, Frank had insisted on calling in, walked directly onto the ballroom floor of the Havenwood Country Club. Through the throngs of the town's elite, he walked right up to the head table, where Alistair was holding court, laughing with the mayor. The music screeched to a halt. The joyous chatter died. 100 pairs of eyes, the eyes of the people who had enabled him, admired him, and feared him, turned to watch. Alistair Blackwood. Henderson's voice boomed across the silent ballroom. You are under arrest for the murder of Ethan Thomas, and for the illegal disposal of hazardous materials resulting in multiple deaths. The collective gasp was a physical thing. Alistair's face went from ruddy confidence to a blotchy purple rage. This is insane. You're finished, Henderson. You're all finished, he bellowed, his voice losing its cultivated charm, revealing the raw, primal ugliness beneath. But as the troopers cuffed his hands behind his back, his threats sounded hollow, the pathetic death rattle of a king whose crown had just been knocked into the gutter. He was frog-marched out of the ballroom, past the stunned, horrified faces of the people whose town he had built on a foundation of poison and lies. The tables had not just turned, they had been set on fire. The video leaked to a national news agency by Frank was already going viral. A grainy, 8mm snuff film that was destroying a dynasty in real time. The name Blackwood, once a symbol of prosperity, would forever be synonymous with murder. The poetic justice was biblical. He was unmade in front of the very audience he had spent a lifetime cultivating. The aftermath was a quiet, painful dawn after a long and violent night. The quarry, now a Superfund site, was a swarm of federal investigators in hazmat suits. Dredged the pit where Ethan had been thrown. It took 3 weeks. Lorraine waited every day, sitting in her car on the ridge overlooking the scene. A silent, patient vigil. They found him, or what was left of him, preserved by the toxic sludge that had been his tomb. They found the remnants of his clothing, the metal buckles of his camera bag. It was enough. He was coming home. The funeral was small, private. Just Lorraine, Frank, and a tearful, guilt-ridden Clara. They buried him in the town cemetery, on a hill overlooking the valley. Under a simple granite stone that Lorraine had commissioned. Ethan Thomas, 198-11998. He told the stories that mattered. Truth finally found. Clara, her testimony having been crucial in securing the conviction against Blackwood and his cronies, sold her house and moved away, seeking an anonymity she would likely never find. Before she left, she gave Lorraine the cobalt blue wind chimes. They now hung on Lorraine's porch, their haunting. Musical clinking, no longer a sound of ghostly terror, but a bittersweet lullaby, a song of remembrance. The town of Havenwood was broken, but it was also beginning to heal. The Blackwood Empire crumbled, its assets seized, its name a curse. The families downstream who had suffered from mysterious illnesses for years finally had an answer, and with it, the grounds for a lawsuit that would provide for them for generations. A class action suit, funded by a national environmental group, was named the Ethan Thomas Act. His name, once a forgotten footnote in a cold case file, was now a symbol of justice. Lorraine never sought the spotlight. She refused the interviews, the book deals, the movie offers. Her victory was not in the headlines or the public fall of a powerful man. It was in the quiet moments on her porch, listening to the wind chimes. It was in the simple, profound knowledge that she had done right by her son. She had fought the monster and won. She had brought her boy home. The story of Havenwood became a cautionary tale, a viral sensation that people shared with a mixture of rage and grim satisfaction. It was a story about the evil that festers behind the polished facade of power and wealth, the way a community's willful blindness can allow a predator to flourish. But more than that, it was a story about a mother's love, a force of nature more powerful than any dynasty, more persistent than any secret. It was a testament to the fact that no injustice is so deeply buried that it cannot be unearthed by A single, determined voice, armed with the truth. And sometimes, the quietest whispers, the ones carried on the wind through a set of old, forgotten chimes, can become the roar that brings an empire to its knees. The world keeps turning, and evil often hides in plain sight, until someone, finally, dares to listen.